head is found near a large pool of blood. And witnesses say more demonstrations have been taking place in Benghazi on Friday.
What's happening in Benghazi is a big massacre. People are being killed on the streets. People are demonstrating peacefully. They are asking for a decent life, not more than a decent life. There is in front of me, in front of the main court in Benghazi, more than 50,000 people.
With tight controls on media and communications in Libya, it's been difficult to confirm the extent of the protests and the violence. But with the regime vowing to crush any further attempt to challenge Gaddafi, more unrest is likely to come. Hazem Sika, AlJazeera.
Meanwhile, in Yemen, at least 3 people have been killed during anti-government protests. It brings the total number of dead to 6. That's in the last 24 hours. The so-called Friday of Rage drew thousands of protesters onto the streets. Demonstrations erupted across the country for an 8th straight day as calls for the president to resign grow ever louder. And clashes have also erupted between pro- and anti-government protesters in Jordan. At least 8 people were injured when scuffles broke out in the capital, Amman. They broke out just after Friday prayers. Opposition protesters are demanding more freedoms and lower food prices. Well, meanwhile, tens of thousands of people returned to Cairo's Liberation Square on Friday to mark 1 week since Hosni Mubarak relinquished his powers as president. Our correspondent Rawia Rage has the details.
Draped in red, white and black, thousands of Egyptians come to Tahrir Square, this time not in protest, rather to mark their hard-won victory.
Contrary to the scenes of anger and frustration that lasted here in Tahrir Square for days before Hosni Mubarak stepped down, the mood this Friday is one of joy and celebrations, smiles everywhere.
And a tribute to the country's military, who even before the end of Mubarak's rule last week was hailed for not obstructing the pro-democracy movement. The military had asked Egyptians to stop their protests, but it did not prevent the gathering on Friday. Instead, Tahrir was surrounded by tanks and soldiers who searched people and regulated traffic. The gathering not only a victory march, but also a memorial to the 300+ people who lost their lives in the uprising. The highlight of the day, an appearance by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, one of Sunni Islam's most prominent clerics. In a heartfelt ceremony, he praised the revolution, the youth behind it, and the military, though he did make a direct request.
I call on the Egyptian army to liberate us from the government that Mubarak formed in his last days. We want a new government that does not include the old faces that remind people of poverty and misery.
But he also urged patience with the country's interim military leadership. The current cabinet was appointed by Mubarak before he stepped down. A reshuffle is expected in the coming few days.
I came here all the way from Upper Egypt because all I want is an end to corruption. We want this government changed. We don't want Mubarak's party members in power.
It is true that we need to be patient, but at the same time we need to remind the government and whoever is there that we are still in the streets and we still have a lot of other demands that they need to pay attention to.
And until they see the country's 30-year emergency law lifted and the thousands of political prisoners released, many say they will keep the pressure. Rawia Rage, AlJazeera, Cairo.
Well, a little earlier I spoke to our correspondent Hoda Abdelhamid, who's also in Cairo. I began by asking to describe the mood in Egypt a week after Mubarak stepped down.
Well, I think that you have people celebrating, and on the other hand, you have people who are a bit worried. They're worried because they're not reading very clearly what the army is intending to do. On the face of it, on what the army has been saying so far, it seems that the army is listening and is acting according to the demands of the pro-democracy campaigners. But certain people do say that the army is not acting with enough transparency. says that it's taking its decisions unilaterally without consulting with the opposition, without consulting enough with the youth, and there's a certain worry about that. But then you'd have other people who tell you, wait and see a few more weeks just on what course the country's going.
Hoda, we can hear the cheers of the thousands of people gathered still on the streets of Cairo behind you. From the people that you've spoken to, why do you think they're there? Do you think that they feel that they need to show their presence to make sure that authorities know that they're still there and there's still a power to be reckoned with?
Well, they're here to certainly celebrate what they see as a victory, just the ousting of the president, the fact that his son is not in the picture anymore, and his closest henchmen have been ousted as well. But they're also here because they want to make sure that their demands are actually followed very closely. They were calling for the fall of a regime, but the end of a system. It's the entire system that they don't agree with. And today's slogans were calling for a purification of the system, meaning that there are still people who are in very high positions here, that the same modus operandi of the government is still in place, and all that needs to change. There were also calls for the change of the prime minister. That's the caretaker prime minister. Actually been nominated by Hosni Mubarak a few days after the protest started. So they do want to make sure that the message is clear. We're going to give a chance to the army, but the road to Liberation Square is known by every Egyptian, and as long as all our demands are not met and the entire system is not changed, they will come back and they will hold more rallies and protests.
AlJazeera's Hoda Abdelhamid there overlooking Liberation Square. Still to come, they've done it before, but will they do it again? The UN Security Council prepares to vote on whether Israeli settlements are illegal. And in Uganda, voters turn out for the second election in 30 years. We'll have all the details after the break.
As the clouds roll in across the Mediterranean, you'll still find it easy to drift away.
Hello again. Well, still for South America, there's lots of wet weather with us at the moment. Here's a satellite picture, and you can see these bright white areas of cloud here in the west, particularly heavy there just to the north of Lima. Torrential downpours out of that, and that won't help the flooding situation that we've seen in many of these South American countries over the last week or so. So yet more wet weather is on the cards over the next few days, and not only for the western parts of South America, also further east as well. For the northern parts of Brazil, it's going to be very, very wet, and also down further south through parts of Paraguay and into the extreme southern parts of Brazil as well. Buenos Aires, though, here we should get away with a fine day, and it will be warm. 29 degrees our maximum. A bit further east, and of course here we've still got the remains of a cyclone with us. This one is Bingiza, gradually now running away towards the southeast. It's still throwing lots of wet weather though around Madagascar, heaviest in the east there, and also for the northwestern parts. And then this